Yeah, I know. Tell me about it. Oh, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Piper's Paraphrases. I'm Professor Pipes, and I'm here to tell you about the last act of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. I know what you're thinking. It's about dang time. But before we get there, let's review the other 4 acts, and I'll try to keep it less than 2 hours long. Romeo Montague and Juliet Capulet fell in love in spite of their family feud, and they secretly got married. But then Romeo killed Juliet's cousin and got banished, so he went to hide out in a nearby town. Meanwhile, Juliet's parents had arranged a wedding between her and Paris, but the friar came up with a plan. He gave Juliet a sleeping potion so that when her parents came to get her for her wedding, they would think she was dead and put her in the family tomb instead. Now to Act 5. For this act, we will be using a death counter. So far, we're at 2. Mercutio and Tybalt, in case you already forgot. For Scene 1, it's time to go on a little field trip. No, Cooper, we haven't got the budget for that. We're just heading over to Mantua. Here, we see Romeo in a super happy mood, describing a great dream he had about being dead. Seriously, he and I have very different ideas of good dreams. Well, in his dream, Juliet breathed life into him, and then he became an emperor. So, happy ending, I guess. Just then, interrupting this dreamy soliloquy, Romeo's friend and servant Balthazar arrives, because he has news to give Romeo. Unfortunately, he did not bring news from the friar. Instead, he says that he saw the Capulets putting Juliet's dead body in the family tomb. Romeo freaks out, but tells Balthazar that everything's fine and sends him away to get horses. Meanwhile, Romeo buys poison from an apothecary and reveals to the audience that he plans to kill himself beside Juliet's body. In Scene 2, we head back to Friar Lawrence's place. And we meet a new guy. Cooper, don't you dare guess that it's some celebrity again. You know it's Friar John. Friar John was the guy that was supposed to deliver Friar Lawrence's letter to Romeo. You know, the letter that explained that Juliet isn't actually dead. Seeing as Romeo did not get that letter and Friar John is not in Mantua, he clearly failed. And why, you ask? Go on, ask. Because he was quarantined, and the health officials wouldn't let him leave. Man, I wonder what that must be like. Anyway, Friar Lawrence freaks out and heads out to go rescue Juliet. Scene 3 is super long, which makes sense since it's the very last one, and both Romeo and Juliet are still alive, so I guess we've still got quite a bit of dying to do. Scene 3 also takes place in a graveyard. Ooh, spooky. It begins with Paris, who sends his servant away to watch for grave robbers while he brings flowers to the Capulet tomb for his lost fiancée. What a nice guy. When Paris hears someone approaching, he hides in the shadows. Just then, Romeo enters with Balthazar, but he tells Balthazar to leave and deliver a letter to his parents in the morning. Balthazar, who's worried about Romeo, decides to hide nearby, but pretty soon he falls asleep. Useless. Paris recognizes Romeo and assumes he's there to desecrate the tomb of Tybalt, the man he murdered, so Paris steps out of the shadows to defend Juliet's family tomb. Paris's servant sees them and runs off to get the cops. Romeo tells Paris to run away, but Paris refuses, and Romeo soon stabs him. In his final moments, Paris asks to be placed beside his beloved Juliet. Poor Paris deserved better. Oh, but that's number 3 on our death count. Romeo realizes that Paris must be the guy that Balthazar apparently told him about earlier, the one who wanted to be married to Juliet, so he agrees to place Paris beside the woman they both loved. And then he enters the tomb. Romeo sees Juliet and delivers a soliloquy, saying how she still looks beautiful, as if she weren't even dead. That's because she's not, dummy. Her cheeks are red. She's about to wake up. Just give it a minute, you impatient fool. But this is Romeo, so of course he doesn't. Instead, he drinks the poison, kisses her one last time, and dies. Death number 4. Next, Friar Lawrence enters the graveyard and wakes up Balthazar, who says he dreamed that Romeo killed someone. Dude, not a dream. Friar Lawrence is worried, so he heads toward the tomb, where he finds both Paris and Romeo dead. And then Juliet wakes up. Friar Lawrence hears the police coming, so he tells Juliet that she needs to leave, but she refuses. And Friar Lawrence leaves. I guess none of his backup plans involved raising the dead. Juliet wants to poison herself with Romeo's poison, but it's empty, so she kisses him, hoping there's poison still left on his lips. If this weren't heartbreaking enough, Shakespeare really twists the knife in us when Juliet mentions that Romeo's lips are still warm. She realizes that had she woken up a moment earlier, he would still be alive. Speaking of twisting the knife in, Juliet grabs Romeo's dagger and stabs herself, and dies beside her husband. That's 5. And after this sad moment, absolute chaos. The cops have arrived with Friar Lawrence and Balthazar in tow. Pretty soon the prince, Lord Montague, and Lord and Lady Capulet all arrive. Lady Montague isn't there because apparently she died of heartbreak that night because of her son's banishment. Which brings our final death count to 6. Everyone sees the dead bodies, including the one that clearly just died, even though they thought she was already dead. I'd imagine they're thinking this might be the start of a zombie apocalypse. Friar Lawrence then explains everything he knows about Romeo and Juliet and their secret relationship. And the letter that Romeo gave to Balthazar confirms it all. The prince tells Capulet and Montague that their children died because of the feud. So the two old rivals shake hands and agree to end the feud. Montague even says he'll build a golden statue of Juliet. Not to be outdone, Capulet says he'll build a golden statue of Romeo. All right, guys, no feud means no one-upping each other either. The prince jumps in and ends the show, saying that everyone should share this story. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. The end. Well, not quite, because we still need to talk about characters. Just kidding, they're all dead. Let's talk themes instead. As always, our first theme is love. And we've got it all in this act. We see Paris's love for Juliet. Clearly, he truly was in love, as he lost his life fighting to protect her family's honor, and his dying request was to be placed beside Juliet. Even Romeo accepts this and honors the request. We also see the parental love of Montague and Capulet. They loved their children so much that they ended a feud that has lasted longer than anyone can remember. A feud so desperate that people fought and died for it. But at the end of the day, their children were more important. Too little, too late, guys. And of course, we see the love of Romeo and Juliet. Now, don't get me wrong. Their love is not the stuff of great romances, or at least enviable romances. We're not supposed to idolize them and say, "Oh my gosh, I love Timmy. We're basically Romeo and Juliet." The two are idiotic, hormonal teens. We're supposed to see that. The whole point is that they continue to make bad decisions and choose each other over everything else, even their own lives. Rather than run away together or just tell the truth and face the consequences, they'll kill themselves. They're rash, impulsive, and impractical. They may be in love, but that doesn't mean their actions are romantic or heroic, showing that sometimes our emotions can overwhelm our rationality. Next up, destiny, or fate. And this act starts off strong with the destiny talk. When we first see Romeo, he's talking about a dream he had where Juliet finds him dead and then kisses him and he comes back to life. Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad for a prophetic dream. We now know that Juliet does find Romeo dead, and she kisses him. Too bad he didn't magically wake up. This is now the second dream that Romeo discusses, and both of them come true. Then, not long later, when Balthazar tells him that Juliet is dead, Romeo says, "Then I defy you, stars." He decides to try to go against his fate of being separated from Juliet by killing himself. Of course, we know that by trying to go against this fate, he causes it. Finally, after Romeo kills Paris and realizes who he is, he says that Paris is one writ with me in sour misfortune's book. In other words, he is claiming that both he and Paris are the victims of fate. Romeo totally didn't murder Paris with his sword. Fate did it. No, Cooper, you can't just say that fate stole my shoes. I know it was you. So, who does everyone else blame at the end of the play? Was it all destiny? Well, when Friar Lawrence comes to get Juliet, he mentions that a greater power than we can contradict hath thwarted our intents, meaning that fate, or heaven, got in the way of the friar's plan. Prince Aeschylus, on the other hand, gives us a kind of mixed response. Typical politician. He tells Montague and Capulet that heaven finds means to kill your joys with love. So he does say that Romeo and Juliet's deaths were decided by heaven, but he also said that Capulet and Montague were the ones that caused it. According to the prince, heaven killed Romeo and Juliet because the families carried on their feud. So it was both fate and not fate. Interesting take, Shakespeare. Next, let's discuss time, or age. Really, I just want to point out the span of time over which the story took place. Let's recall. The play contains 1 masquerade, 1 wedding, 1 funeral, 2 engagements, 3 sword fights, and 6 deaths. And it takes place over 4.5 days. That's right. It starts out Sunday morning and ends sometime in the middle of the night Wednesday or early Thursday morning. It's been less than a week, and yet so much has happened, and most of it was pretty terrible. So it seems like maybe rushing into things isn't such a great idea. People need to take their time and think things through. Next, let's talk about communication. Get it? Talk about communication? Anyway, modern day there are a lot of stories and articles about how technology is ruining the world because it leads to less communication. However, man, would Romeo and Juliet have been simpler if they had a cell phone. Observe. Hello, Friar Lawrence. Juliet's dead. What am I gonna do? Oh, she's faking her death. Okay, great. Bye. So, maybe it's not that technology is the bad thing. Maybe people just suck at communicating. And we always have. We see this theme in simple, comedic ways throughout the story. Like when Romeo is being emo in Act 1 and wants attention so he won't tell Benvolio about his crush. Or when Capulet's servant can't read the invite list. Or when the nurse jokingly won't tell Juliet what Romeo said about marriage. However, we see this in a lot of important ways too. Romeo and Juliet didn't tell their families or friends about their relationship. Romeo doesn't tell Tybalt that he's his cousin now. Juliet lies to the nurse about marrying Paris. The friar's letter doesn't reach Romeo. And all this miscommunication culminates in the tragic deaths of Romeo and Juliet. If only Montague and Capulet had been willing to listen to each other and talk over their problems long ago. If only all people made more of an effort to communicate with and understand one another. Finally, let's discuss opposition. The entire play has been leading us to this inevitable conclusion. We're informed at the very start of the play that Romeo and Juliet will die, and their love will end the hatred. So, we have not only the opposites of love and hate, but we also see the fruitlessness of opposition. It's clear that opposition leads only to destruction. Even Romeo deciding to oppose what he sees as his destiny leads to his death. And Paris opposing whom he believes to be in opposition to his fiancée's family leads to his death. But of course the biggest example is the feud. In fact, this opposition kind of connects all the themes. Because the two families hated each other, Romeo and Juliet rushed their relationship, feeling that they needed to get married quickly before their parents could separate them. Because the two families hated each other, Romeo and Juliet didn't tell their families about their relationship. Because the two families hated each other, it seemed that fate was against them. Or, according to the friar and the prince, that the heavens wanted to punish the families for their hatred. And because the two families hated each other, Romeo and Juliet had to hide their love and could only be together at night. In fact, every scene between the two of them, other than the wedding itself, occurs at night. In this way, the motif of light and dark reinforces the opposition of the families and reminds the audience that opposition tears people apart. And now that the whole play is over and done, I'd like to leave you with some final food for thought. As you look back over the play, consider these questions. First, who or what is actually to blame for the tragedy? Second, what's your opinion about Friar Lawrence abandoning Juliet in the tomb, knowing she would likely kill herself? Third, Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy, and in tragedies, the lead characters have flaws that cause their downfall. What was the flaw, or flaws, Romeo and Juliet had? Fourth, what do you think Shakespeare is trying to say about destiny and fate? And finally, Prince Aeschylus says that the story of Romeo and Juliet needs to be told. Why do you think he thought that? Why is it important that this story continues to be told? Thanks for watching this episode of Piper's Paraphrases. And from Shakespeare to me to you, peace!